A cloth-hooded acolyte shoved aside a low branch and the empty cradle moved under the moonlight. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as he stepped forward. The narrator heard the prophet intone a short name, and the hooded circle answered with the scrape of wood on packed earth. The first line of dispute came fast.
A sudden rupture
"Do you
tears through
bind
the
the
fabric
lineage,
of the
the
land.
prophet, voice even?"
The effigy.
The narrator answered nothing and kept his hand on the leather grimoire beneath his coat. The grove smelled of damp leaves and tallow. The narrator had come because he catalogued rights, because he could not ignore reports that named whole families and offices as targets. He checked the pocket watch with a thumb, more to steady his pulse than to know the hour. He had a ledger of sightings, a list of ruined altars, a single line of cautious notes from an anonymous informant. Those items defined his work more than any title. He moved closer until his breath steamed thin in front of the hooded faces. The prophet's voice cut the air. "This cradle holds a promise. The end will wash away the ledger of names." The acolytes spoke the response in a low monotone. The scribe stood 2 steps behind the prophet, hands pressed against a bone-wrapped staff. The narrator watched the scribe's ink, stained fingers flex. The scribe caught the narrator's eye, and something passed between them, a flash of recognition that required quick judgment. The narrator had a method. He recorded gestures, he counted steps in a rite, he marked exactly who touched which object. He did not sit and theorize. Here, under the cold moon, he took pages from his satchel and made a small list in the margin. Names seen, symbols carved into the cradle, the way the prophet's scar caught the moon. The list gave him a concrete map to follow later. He did not yet know the full doctrine, but the concrete action, the empty cradle, the carved sigil, the naming of roles, showed him the danger. The cult aimed to erase human continuity. They dispersed without a formal goodbye. The acolytes moved like trained laborers, lifting the cradle and slipping it along a shadowed path. The narrator followed at a measured distance. He kept his hand on the grimoire. He heard no chants once they left the clearing, only the scraping of wood and the distant lap of water. The air smelled briefly of myrrh and the metallic tang of something burned. At the canvas, tent a short distance away, the scribe met him inside with a codex wrapped in oilcloth. The tent smelled of wax, ink, and cold earth. The scribe's voice came in a near whisper. "You came, narrator." He set the wrapped ledger on the table and unfolded a finger to point at the edge of a charred page. "Read." "Please read." The narrator lifted the paper and found a list. Births, names, a sequence of households with marginal marks that meant to be ended. The marks, the narrator and his voice did not carry judgment. "What do they mean, scribe?" "They mean removal," the scribe answered. "They mean the line is cut." He kept his hands flat, palms down on the oilcloth, and his fingers trembled where the ink had stained them. "The prophet taught us a sequence. We mark those who will be unmade." The narrator turned a page and read aloud a single phrase, inked along the margin. "The end is salvation." He looked up. The scribe's lips were dry. "We vow to remove names from roll and memory." The scribe, "We vow to stop children from being registered. We vow to burn records so they are not counted." They argued in short, clipped lines. The narrator for sources. The scribe offered a trembling citation. A hymn half remembered, passed down in the prophet's mouth. "The prophet the void receives the spared. The scribe, he being unmade, returns the spirit to a pure silence." The narrator repeated the words out loud and noted the physical reaction. The scribe's jaw tightening, the wetness at the eyes. Outside, a branch cracked sharply. The narrator stepped to the tent flap and peered out. The grove's path had been swept. Nearby embers still smoked where someone had ground out a torch. The narrator catalogued these details the way a surgeon reads blood patterns. He the scribe to reconstruct a recent rite from memory. The scribe moved to the workbench and began to speak in measured, concrete fragments. "We enter barefoot." The scribe, "We circle the cradle 3 times." The prophet draws a sigil on the wood with a bone stylus. He lays a vow on it. He names a registry or a household. "We blow out the candle. We promise to stop the next birth. 1 name at a time." He tapped the table. "I wrote it down. I wrote it while I still believed." The narrator wrote as the scribe spoke. He noted gestures. A thumb dragged across a heel of a hand, a foot stepping over a small pile of ash. He recorded the vow line for line. Each detail provided a blueprint. The scribe kept adding specifics that escalated the picture. How they left tokens under doors, how they bribed a clerk in a provincial house to delay a birth entry, how they placed small fires near registry ledgers to test the night watch. The actions made the doctrine operational. The doctrine now had mechanisms. At dawn, the narrator left the tent and walked toward a ruined monastery where he kept a map of civic registries. He found the archive door jammed and the lint smeared with ash. He pried it open and stepped into a room of collapsed racks. On a low shelf he found a charred codex, half burned, its edges blackened and brittle. He pried loose a scorched folio and read a single legible line. A name crossed out with 3 small slashes and a notation beside it that matched the grooves he had seen in the cradle. The notation named the provincial registry as the next target. The narrator's hand tightened around the folio until the leather under his palm creased. The discovery made the threat immediate. Someone had planned an assault not on a family but on the institutions that kept human continuity. That afternoon he found the provincial registry building listed in the Codex S margin. He marked the time it would be vulnerable. A midwinter night when the registry S clerk would be alone. The narrator did not leave the monastery with idle dread. He mapped actions. He sent a terse note to a friendly magistrate in the next town, asked discreet questions about watch rotations, and arranged to be near the registry on the night listed in the Codex. He returned to the grove at Pra, dawn, and found the prophet alone in a ruined chapel beneath faded frescoes. The prophet sat with the bone staff across his lap and looked like a man waiting for a small, inevitable thing. The narrator him directly, "Why the registry? Who gave you that list?" The prophet smiled once, small and deliberate. "I speak for a necessary end," he said. "The ledger is a burden." "Arashur is mercy." He tilted his head and watched the narrator. "Do you want mercy, narrator?" "I want names preserved," the narrator replied. "I want births recorded so people can find their kin. You move in paper and memory. The prophet, we move in unbinding." He lifted his hand and a smear of ritual scarification near his temple caught the chapel light. The narrator noted the scarce pattern. It matched a glyph in the folio. They spoke in short exchanges that put pressure on choices. The prophet offered transcendence, a removal of responsibility, a rhetorical ease. The narrator answered with questions about method, about the logistics of Erasha. The prophet named the provincial registry as the clearest point of attack. Burn the rolls, stop births from being entered, remove names so they vanish from civic memory. The prophet's voice did not rise, but the chapel's cold seemed to tighten around them. The narrator left with a plan. He would watch the registry the night the Codex predicted. He would position himself at an alley across the courtyard. He would try to stop the acolytes if he could. He also knew the scribe would be there. He had to decide whether to trust the scribe's earlier trembling testimony or to see the scribe as an active conspirator. That decision moved his feet more surely than his doubts. The midnight assault arrived like a small thunder. Torches flared along the registry as stone fired. Figures moved with the quickness of people who had rehearsed. The narrator held his breath behind a low wall and counted the acolytes as they split toward the shutters. He saw the scribe at the edge of the group, hands ink, stained and close to a satchel. The scribe looked at the narrator once in a quick blink. The prophet stepped past the doorway with a bone-wrapped staff and spoke the vow aloud. "By the bone, by the void, we remove names from this ledger," he intoned. Acolytes spread across the courtyard and set small fires at the base of the registry door. The narrator moved now, not to speak but to block. He vaulted the low wall and landed with the grimoire pressed to his chest. "Stop!" The narrator barked. "Stop now!" He reached for the nearest arm and the acolyte twisted away like an animal. The scribe stepped forward between the flicker of torchlight and the registry door. "Scribe, what are you doing?" The narrator demanded. "This is mercy." The scribe, "This is what we promised." His voice shook. The scribe held a small bundle of scorched paper and a thin cord. The prophet smiled and spoke softly. "Lay the cord. Do not hesitate." We will be spared the weight of future loss. He extended his hand as if offering a simple tool. Words compressed into action. Acolytes shoved at the shutters. Flames licked the timber. The narrator tried to wrench open a shutter and felt someone cut across his hand with a blunt grip. The scribe's fingers moved toward the cord. The narrator lunged, grabbing the scribe's wrist. Scribe, stop. The narrator in short, hard breaths. Scribe, listen to me. The scribe looked at him and did not pull back. The prophet stepped forward and said, "Drop it, narrator. You will not stop what must be done." He put a hand on the scribe's shoulder. The scribe did not pull away. For 3 rapid exchanges they spoke and acted in quick succession. Scribe, do not burn the registry. The narrator, scribe, think of names. You are wrong. The prophet. You always were wrong, the prophet added. The scribe's hand tightened on the cord. The narrator twisted the wrist. The cord slipped from the scribe's fingers and fluttered to the flagged stones. The scribe made a single choice. He bent and snatched the cord back. Then he shoved the small bundle of papers toward the nearest torch. The narrator saw the flame touch the edge of a roll. He pushed and struck the torch holder, knocking the flame sideways. The roll flared. The scribe screamed once and then ran into the smoke between bodies. The narrator moved to the registry door and beat at it with his fists. A clerk inside had roused and slammed a shutter. Fire licked the hinges. The acolytes worked a wedge into the lock. The narrator found a length of iron and jammed it against the wedge. He felt hands at his coat and pulled the grimoire inside with him. Inside the registry it was hot and the smell of singed vellum filled the room. The clerk, a woman with a salt-streaked braid, pushed a tray of rolls toward the narrator. "Take what you can," she said. "Save the names." The narrator grabbed what he could. A folio eaten at the edges but still bound, a roster of births that recorded months and midwives, a list of names with seals. He stuffed them into the grimoire's hollowed space and wrapped the bundle with oilcloth. Outside, the courtyard blurred with motion. The prophet's voice rose in a chant, and the acolytes tried to force the door. The narrator heard the scribe's footfalls in the alley and then silence. He forced the shutter open enough to see a hand slip a scorched folio through. A dozen names on that folio had black edges. The narrator yanked the folio free, feeling the heat on his fingers. He ran through the alleyways with the salvaged folio under his arm. He did not pause to think beyond pressing the paper flat against his chest so the names would not curl into flame. He heard shouts and the distant sound of a bell. He turned a corner and nearly collided with the scribe. The scribe's face was streaked with soot. His eyes avoided direct contact. "Scribe, the narrator, why? Why did you go back?" The scribe put a hand over his mouth. "I had to finish the list," he said. "I had to make sure certain names were not written." He spoke in short sentences and his voice trembled. "I saw a family name I knew. I could not let it be born into that ledger. You thought you could decide who counted. The narrator, scribe, you wrote those names. You wrote N next to a child who had not yet been born." The narrator's tone was sharp and controlled. "You risked removing people from historical record." He looked at the folio in his hands, at the thin black edges. The scribe crumpled a small scrap of vellum between his fingers. He looked as if he might speak in defense, and then stopped. "I believed he meant mercy." The scribe, "I thought I was sparing someone a life of pain. But now," he closed his mouth, swallowed, and forced himself steady. "Now there is blood on the page." The narrator did not answer with a lecture. He set the folio on a low stone and flattened it. He checked each name he could make out and read them aloud. He read names of households, the marks of midwives, the registry clerk's seal. He wrote down the most at-risk offices on a scrap of parchment. He gave the scrap to a magistrate's courier who passed by and instructed him to warn the clerks in neighboring towns. They separated before dawn. The scribe disappeared into a tangle of alleys with his satchel. The narrator moved to a small study stacked with papers and set the scorched folio on a table. He unwrapped it and began a slow, surgical cataloging. He recorded which names had been lost to the flame's edge, which rolls had survived, and which offices bore signs of infiltration. He placed a thin strip of gold leaf between 2 pages to mark the highest risk entry. The gold would not save them, but it would focus attention. Night turned toward pale light. The narrator made a list of civic offices to contact and a plan for protective watches. He mapped the network of likely acolyte movements based on the ritual gestures he had observed. He set down names he would need to interview again. The prophet, the scribe, the clerk who had shoved rolls to safety, the magistrate's courier. He felt a narrow, practical resolve take over his hands. A soft knock sounded at the study door. The narrator did not start with some airy thought. He stepped to the door and opened it to a woman in a courier's cloak. Her palms were rough from travel. "There have been others," she said. "We found scorch marks at a midwife's house 2 miles north. A ledger is missing." She handed him a short list and a pressed palm-sized amulet found in the suit. "Watch the registries tonight." Dante let them take more names. The narrator took the list and looked at the amulet. He set the salvaged folio into the grimoire's hollow and closed the cover. He slid a ribbon beneath it and sealed the leather with wax. The narrator then unfurled a map and pinned the courier's list to it. He marked the registry locations in black ink and circled the most at risk. He did not speak of fate or destiny. He did not compose a speech. He wrote an urgent note and sealed it for the magistrate. He made a careful notation of the scribe's last seen direction and the prophet's pattern of movement. He closed the study shutters, but not before he placed a small lamp by the map and left the lamp's wick trimmed to burn steadily. Outside, a distant bell told the hour. The narrator listened to its steady sound and then returned to the map. He did not know whether he would find the scribe again, nor whether the prophet would retreat. He knew only the concrete tasks ahead: warn clerks, protect ledgers, and trace where the cult's marks had first appeared. The salvaged folio lay inside the grimoire like a wounded thing. The narrator put his hand on the leather and felt the warmth of it, the burn smell faint under his fingernails. He set the grimoire on a shelf and lit the final wick. He would follow the scribe's trail, but he also set a watch in the registry towns. He closed the study door and, before he left, pinned to the map an inked note: "Watch the cradle sites." Then he stepped into the pale morning and moved toward the next point on his list. A single footprint in the alley hinted at which direction the scribe had taken. The footprint ended abruptly where the cobbles sloped into darkness. The narrator traced that direction with his eyes, folded the map, and walked out with the salvaged folio secured inside the grimoire. The chapter ends with the narrator locking the study door and tucking the sealed folio into his satchel, then following the faint footprint down the lane toward the market where the scribe had vanished. A hooded acolyte snapped a wax seal and shoved a small box across the stone bench. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as he reached, fingers close to the black wax, before he forced himself to stop. The room smelled of cold smoke and beeswax. The first line of conflict arrived in a single, clipped sentence. "We mark them now," said the acolyte. Suspicion, not fear, led his movements in those first seconds. He watched names travel from ink to seal and understood that doctrine had shifted into a timetable. The narrator had seen zeal before. He had read charters and listened to late-night depositions. He had catalogued threats. He also remembered the moonlit cradle from the first testimony, how an empty child's bed had been pushed under the moon, and the prophet had spoken a single name. That memory hung as a fact, a baby left alone beneath the sky. He used it now as a calibrator. If the prophet had once intoned a name at a cradle and drawn a crowd, then sealing boxes with names meant the cult had moved from ritual theater to targeted action. He did not introduce himself. He stepped from the shadowed corridor into the annex and let his coat brush a cracked column. He had a pocket watch. He kept it closed. He kept his voice measured. "Scribe," he said. "Stop." The scribe dropped a wrapped tablet. The package thumped onto flagstone and slid toward the altar. The narrator's voice carried the single, precise tone he used to interrupt when evidence needed freezing. The scribe looked up. "Narrator." The scribe answered, breath tight, "You should not be here. Why are you sealing names?" The narrator's question cut into the room like a cold blade. He stepped closer and saw the codex wrappings piled near the prophet's bench. The scribe's fingers trembled. He pushed hair from his forehead and said, "It is the charter. It is the plan. It is mercy. Mercy for whom? The narrator." He drew closer to read a smudge of ink on the nearest box, a single surname and a date. The scribe swallowed and did not look at the boxes, names of those who must be offered. They are chosen. They free the whole. Dialogue in that cramped space became the vehicle for the first reveal. The narrator kept his sentences short. He for documents, he for the logic. He did not ask for confession. The scribe finally moved. He stepped away from the bench and lifted a cloth that hid a thin codex page. He held it as if it might combust. The fragment was blackened at one edge. Inked lines remained in an angular hand. The narrator read a column where theology met calendar, rites attached to names, dates, and locations. The scribe's hand hovered over a line that listed a magistrate and a coastal hamlet due on the third night of the new moon. They have schedules. The narrator, "This is a campaign." His voice was flat. He kept the emotion of suspicion active in the room. He watched the scribe. He watched the prophetess bench for movement. The scribe muttered, "It is salvation. It is returned to quiet. Who signed this?" The narrator demanded, his breath fogged in the annex air. At that moment the prophet entered the annex without any visible alarm. He did not hurry. He walked with the slow, ritualized gait the narrator knew from the first testimony. He carried an obsidian pendant at his chest and a single bone. Wrapped staff tapped the flagstone. The prophet stopped at the threshold and scanned the boxes with the same attention he gave to scripture. "You brought company." The prophet quietly. His voice had its usual resonance. It could settle a room or lift a crowd. "You read my list." He did not look at the narrator directly. The narrator kept his hands empty. He kept his questions honest. "Why these names?" he asked. The prophet smiled once. "Because extinction purifies," he said. The scribe flinched. The narrator registered the old argument as doctrine made operative. The prophet's words carried conviction, not pleading. The tone itself declared justification. A second emotional shift moved the narrator. Suspicion tilted toward doubt. He wondered if this was theater. Was the schedule an attempt to frighten opponents, to force them into exile or confession? The scribe's lined fingers, the burn marks on the codex, the neat sealing of wax suggested preparation. Doubt tightened his tongue. He watched the prophet for any tell, an error in ritual, a tremble, a face that might slip into theater. "We have emissaries." The prophet, "Courts send letters. Magistrates will call favors. A few pens and a coin and doors open. We do not unmake without permission from what lies beyond." The narrator kept his voice neutral. "Who are your emissaries?" he asked. "Men in grey houses." The prophet replied, "Women who spin silk and carry that which comforts. Names you will learn when you go to the ports." The narrator drew the scribe aside to a cramped study alcove by the altar. He used the small light of a trembling lamp to read. The charred codex page listed not only names but doctrinal footnotes. There was a mapping of cosmological terms to administrative acts, a line that connected a rendition of unmaking to a ceremony of public erasure. There were columns that listed dates beside magistrates and guild overseers. They tie belief to practice. The narrator, "This is not theory." The scribe's face was close. Ink clung to his fingertips in damp clots. "We do what we must," he said. "We record. If we do not keep record, then the unmaking is lost." The narrator pushed his spectacles up. He steepled, a habit that slowed his speech into evidentiary cadence. The second emotion shift tightened again, moving from doubt to fear. The presence of exact dates and public names transformed theoretical danger into immediate threat. He felt fear not as panic but as a concrete tension. The knowledge that someone on that codex would die on a known night. He the scribe to read the list aloud. The scribe read slowly. He the same magistrate's name he had once heard discussed at a market stall. He the name of an abbess who oversaw a small monastery 3 miles west. He read a coastal captain's name and a merchant's. Each pronouncement landed like a pebble in a quiet pool. The narrator watched rings form and then extend outward toward the city. An external event forced a pivot. Footsteps sounded on the stone threshold. An acolyte returned, breathless, and dropped a scrap of paper. He muttered, "They call from the North Court. They want to discuss favors. They know the list." That single line altered the scale of danger. If magistrates already whispered, then conspirators had begun to move. The narrator stood. He moved past the altar into the nave, where broken windows let dawn spill in. He did not allow the prophet to shepherd him. He demanded names of those emissaries. The prophet named 2 regions and left the rest as intimations. Dialogue came fast and hard. The narrator pressed. The prophet parried with doctrine. The scribe interjected. Rapid back and forth occurred then. 3 to 6 swift exchanges where motives and logistics collided. "Who sends you?" The narrator, a voice older than law. The prophet answered, "Name a man." The narrator insisted, "Ask the captains at the harbor." The prophet replied, "Name a household." The narrator looked to the woman who keeps candles at St. Myron's. The prophet. The exchange exposed the network. Names moved from abstract to actionable. The narrator felt a further shift. Fear became resolve. He would not simply observe, he had to act. A plan took shape in short sentences and checklist movements. Warn the magistrate, find the captain, place a watch by the abyss. The codex offered a twist. The narrator bent over the fragment and found a recently scrawled name in a different ink. It was a name from his own region, written in a cramped hand. He recognized the surname of a clerk who had once turned down a favor for him. The presence of that name re-personalized the danger. The narrator's hands tightened into brief fists. He read the date and understood the immediacy. "This is for tomorrow," he said. The scribe looked at him. "We mark near names to maintain balance." The scribe, "You know this." The narrator felt betrayal before he could name it. The presence of a local name forced a personal choice. Expose the cult and risk immediate violence, or vanish with the fragment and try to warn those listed. His action became motion. He moved again through the nave, toward the central ritual space where acolytes arranged chairs and a single bound figure waited on a lowered dais. The prophet had ordered a demonstration. The space smelled of iron and ash. A young acolyte was tied, eyes wide. He did not struggle. The prophet raised his arms and intoned a phrase that the scribe had once transcribed in careful strokes. The narrator lunged. He reached for the bindings. The acolytes surged. Hands grabbed his sleeves. The prophet's soft smile hardened. "Stop, narrator," the prophet murmured. "See this done once. If unmaking works, you will not stop it again." The narrator kept his voice low. "Let him go," he said. "This is violence. Violence is the name given by those who refuse the unmaking." The prophet replied, "This is mercy." The struggle escalated into immediate, physical confrontation. The narrator pulled. The acolytes pushed. A knife glinted in a seam. The bound acolyte began to cough, and a small flame licked a thin, oil-soaked cloth. The narrator caught the flame with a sleeve and extinguished it on cold stone. He did not allow descriptive metaphors. He recorded concrete sensations. The sting on his knuckles, the grit under his nails, the metallic taste of adrenaline. Each sensation translated into decision. In the scuffle, the narrator found the scribe's eye. The scribe was mouthing something. He motioned with his head toward a crack in the altar, where a codex fragment had been hidden. That silent signal became the mid-chapter mini-cliffhanger. The narrator had to choose: seize the fragment or stop the rite. He lunged for the fragment and was shoved aside mid-reach. The acolytes tightened their circle, and the prophet's chant swelled. A young acolyte's lips began to turn a paler tone. The narrator caught a brief glimpse of the clock tower beyond the broken windows. The shadow said the dawn was near the appointed minute on the codex. He acted fast. He tore a strip from his coat and used it to pry a splinter from the altar where the scribe's finger indicated. His fingers found the hidden page, and he slid it beneath his tunic. The prophet roared then, a sound that was not song but command. The acolytes moved to hold the door. The narrator pushed one aside and found his feet in the rubble-strewn courtyard. The scribe followed, clutching another small sheaf of pages. Both fled into the thin light. Outside, the sun was a narrow bar on the horizon. The narrator pulled the fragment free and read in a steady voice. The scribe fumbled with wax tablets and handed up a charcoal pencil. They mapped the names they knew. They counted the dates, the scale of action assembled on cold, concrete facts, nights, names, places. The narrator felt an emotion shift into grim clarity. Fear had settled into strategy. They split tasks in short sentences. You go west. The narrator, the scribe, warn the abbess. I will find the clerk and the magistrate. Hide the fragment. The scribe nodded and began to run, scarf pulled tight. The narrator stitched a shallow cut on his forearm with a strip of torn cloth. He tasted iron. He did not pause. He tucked the codex fragment into the inside of his coat where the pocket watch sat. He had a route to the magistrate's house. He had allies who owed small, dangerous favors. A surprising moment occurred when a courier intercepted him near the market. The courier handed a sealed letter. The seal bore a sigil similar to those on the annex boxes. The courier's eyes were blank with the kind of avoidance that men adopt when they have been handed orders they do not wish to explain. The narrator opened the letter. It contained a single line, "Delay will cost lives." That twist changed his assessment. Someone beyond the prophet's immediate circle had moved to accelerate the rite. He moved quickly. He sent a runner to the abbess. He bribed a ferryman to delay a captain's departure. He organized 2 watches for the magistrate's home. Each action was concrete. A purse handed, a boot tapping for emphasis, a knock timed against a passing bell. They did not catch the cult. The prophet had already placed emissaries in the courts. A magistrate's clerk refused to leave his post the night before his listed date. I have duty, the narrator argued. He used names. He used dates. He showed the clerk the fragment, and the clerk's face paled when he saw his wife's name on the list. The clerk then became a reluctant ally. He whispered, "Tell me who you suspect." The narrator handed him the fragment. "Hide my watch if they come," the clerk said. He had that tone of smallness that comes when a man is asked to choose sides. The chapter's climax had been the right and the escape. The aftermath narrowed choices. The narrator spent the morning mapping connections the way a cartographer maps coastline. He chained evidence to actions. He wrote down 2 names on the margin of the fragment and circled them. He left a note at the magistrate's door that contained a single request. Look to your allies at the north gate. By late morning the narrator had made a decision that moved the story forward, but resolved the immediate conflict. He would not expose the entire cult in one broadcast. That would risk the lives of those named. He would move stealthily. He would build a file that named emissaries and recorded dates. He would collect witness testimony. He would map trade routes and favored houses. The scribe would write while he questioned. The prophet remained at large. The narrator checked the hidden fragment once more. He pressed his thumb to the edge of the charred paper and let varnish flake onto his palm. He placed the page into a leather pouch and sewed it with a needle he kept in a seam. He slid the pouch beneath his pocket watch and closed the watch. He felt the weight there, and then he heard a knock at the ruined house's outer door. 3 measured strikes. He paled, then controlled his breath. He stepped to the door and opened it a crack. A courier stood outside with a damp cloak. He handed over a small parcel and said, "From the North Court. They demand silence. They offer terms." The narrator took the parcel. He did not open it. He did not speak. He had the names. He had the dates. He had the scribe running west with wax tablets. He had a clerk who would hide his watch if men came asking. The coming rite had a calendar now. The narrator shut the door and set the parcel on the table. He unfolded the map he had drawn from the fragment. He wrote 2 names in the margin and folded the map into his coat. The chapter ends on a concrete beat. He lifted the latch on the inner pocket where he kept the fragment and felt its edges against his palm. He placed the leather pouch back in and buttoned his coat. Then he walked to the window, pushed aside a broken pane, and stepped down into the alley where the scribe waited beneath a damp awning. The narrator touched the scribe's sleeve and said, "We move at dusk." The scribe nodded and produced a small list. The narrator folded the list into his hand and began to walk toward the magistrate's house, keeping his steps low, keeping his watch closed. The list in his hand contained concrete names and dates. The threat had been personalized. The investigation had a first directive. The Charter of Quietus now had a calendar, a list, and witnesses who might live if warned in time. The narrator set his jaw and moved out into the city to begin the long work of prevention. The scribe burst through the hermitage door, manuscript leaves clutched to his chest and salt water spraying from his boots. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw when the scribe shoved the torn pages under the oil lamp and would not let him look away. The prophet has set the day. The scribe voice raw. They choose houses, not offerings. The lamp trembled with the scribe's shaking hand, and a single margin line caught the narrator's eye. A list and a timetable inked in a cramped, patient hand. The narrator moved first. He closed the door, braced the wooden bar, and put the lamp between them. He had been an archival man for 20 years. He knew how manuscripts concealed orders. He knew also the taste of tightness behind the ribs when a theory sharpened into threat. Show me, the narrator. The scribe slid one leaf forward and fingered a black blot where salt had dampened the ink. The scribe kept speaking in halting bursts. He named the ledger the followers called the obsidian list. They mark families now. The scribe, not bundles, not tokens. Names. He set one torn corner against the lamp flame long enough to dry it, and then blew at the curl. The narrator watched the motion, watched the flicked ash, and made a decision in the small, practical way he always did. Record, verify, act. Outside, gulls cried and the sea hit rock. Inside, the scribe paced and unfolded a schedule. He pointed to a column of dates and to household sigils drawn in a narrow hand. We thought Quietus was ceremonial. The scribe, after the cradle and the charter. We thought offerings. But the prophet altered the rite. He moved it out into the open. The narrator reached for the codex wrapped in cloth on his bench and opened it to compare marginal notes he had copied weeks earlier. He found the wax, sealed notation from the Charter of Quietus and set it beside the fresh, torn ledger. The comparison hardened the narrator's face. The wax-sealed box had contained a short oath in the charter, a promise of withholding that read, in translation, a record of symbolic marking. The obsidian list, by contrast, mapped streets and houses. The college-trained part of the narrator calculated the risk. The human part tightened again. If the prophet follows the list, ordinary households will be swept up. The narrator, the scribe's eyes turned to him. The scribe sank onto a broken stool. I copied names, he said. I wrote them to remember. I thought remembering was safe. He rubbed his thumb over ink-stained fingers. The narrator imagined the scrubbed workshops, the cold ink, the wax. He also remembered the moonlit cradle testimony. A hooded acolyte shoved aside a branch, and an empty cradle moved under the moon, and the prophet's short name that made the circle scrape wood. He did not say that aloud. He did instead read the ledger aloud line by line, because action had to be specific. Third house from the north wind. The scribe read, House of Marrows. Marked for release next warning. He paused. The narrator scribbled the coordinates onto a scrap. How many names? The narrator, enough to empty a village, the scribe whispered. He pressed a palm to his mouth, as if to keep the words from flying. The narrator's hands were steady while he folded notes into a bundle. They moved in the small, efficient way of people who had to do something instead of talk. The narrator fetched rope and a satchel. He took the torn ledger fragments and pocketed what he could. The scribe produced wax tablets and a bone stylus to copy the most recent column. We must prove this, the scribe. We must get to the amphitheater before the prophet speaks. The narrator hesitated for less than a breath and then nodded. Suspicion had moved to resolve. They left the hermitage just before dawn, the path slick with spray. The scribe walked close to the narrator, clutching his codex as if it were a child. On the slope they passed a fisherman who raised his hand in greeting and then lowered his gaze when he saw the scribe's stained fingers. The narrator watched that small change. The world was already drawing lines. At the ruined amphitheater the crowd had gathered in a ragged semicircle. The prophet stood on a low dais, robes arranged so that his silhouette read as ritual. The narrator stood near the stone steps in borrowed plain clothes and kept the scribe behind him. He wanted the scribe to be safe and to speak if needed. He wanted proof. The crowd turned when the prophet spoke a single name, and the acolytes answered with the scrape of sandals on stone. The narrator counted the gestures that did not belong to conviction. A hand held too long over a mouth, a foot that did not meet the drum. The prophet's voice filled the amphitheater in the way a bell fills a room. We accelerate the unmaking. He said, we narrow the path for the spirit. We select to spare the rest. A murmur ran through the crowd that was part assent and part bewilderment. The narrator watched faces. He watched the scribe's fingers flex at his side. He watched a woman in the front row whose jaw worked as if to say no. Then a whistle rose short, sharp. A man standing near the amphitheater, a stone wall pointed. He marked my house. The man shouted, he marked my child. The crowd shifted. The prophet turned his head and pointed like a surgeon choosing an incision. You question the process. The prophet. His voice narrowed. He singled out the man with a slow, deliberate motion. He held up an obsidian pendant and the crowd leaned in. The prophet cannot be wrong. An acolyte cried, the unmaking is mercy, another said. The narrator pushed forward, keeping his face impassive. He had a plan to disrupt the ritual if it turned to violence. Intervene, reveal the ledger, call attention to the procedural cruelty. The scribe mouthed a prayer and then clamped his hand over his mouth when the prophet's gaze swept the stones. A shout broke from the wall where a doubting acolyte had been standing. You lie! The acolyte said, you promised offerings, not killings. The prophet's face tightened for the first time. He gestured and two acolytes seized the doubter's arms. The crowd rushed. The narrator caught sight of the man the scribe had named in the ledger. He was dragged forward in a tangle of robes and sobbing hands. The scribe pushed through the press, shouting the name of a household, and the narrator followed. Stop! The scribe yelled, you have a list. This is written, this is procedure. The prophet turned his head slowly and looked at the scribe. The scribe speaks. The prophet. His lips made small, ruling movements. The crowd grew noisier. The narrator reached into his coat and unfurled a torn page, holding it high so the light could catch the ink. Several people in the crowd drew back when they saw the neat columns and the sigils. For a moment, the amphitheater held only the sound of the sea and the rustle of robes. Then the prophet motioned to his inner sanctum, and acolytes surged to form a shield. The narrator tried to step closer. Two acolytes grabbed his forearm. The scribe shoved a scrap under an acolyte's nose and said, read it, read the names. Read the dates. The acolyte blinked and then laughed, a brittle sound. This is blasphemy, he said. The prophet lifted the obsidian pendant and spoke in the old ritual cadence. He laid the ledger on the altar behind him, opened a charred ledger, and pointed to a method written in a steady, clerical hand. He explained how the pendant drew the names into a ritual logic so that selection felt inevitable. The names fix fate, he said. The list sanctifies release. The crowd leaned forward, and whispering turned to acceptance in some pockets. The narrator felt an emotion shift, doubt to urgent fear, when a youth was dragged to the cliff-edge ritual platform. The youth's sandals scraped the stones. He looked from the prophet to the crowd and then at the ocean's blinding line. The narrator lunged. The scribe shoved past him and grabbed the youth's sleeve. Do not take him. The scribe pleaded, the ledger is wrong. Please, hands closed on the scribe's wrist. Acolytes pried the scribe away. The narrator shoved forward and one acolyte swung an elbow. The narrator's knee hit stone. He reached for the obsidian pendant that hung from the prophet's neck as the prophet raised it to pronounce the rite. The pendant flashed a facet of black and the prophet intoned. The scribe tore free, ran, and tried to snatch the pendant. The narrator grabbed the scribe's shoulder and they both fell. The crowd surged like a living thing. The narrator and the scribe grappled on the cliff edge while a chorus of shouts and sudden prayers rolled behind them. The prophet's hand closed on the youth, and the air filled with chanting. The narrator's fingers brushed the pendant. The scribe reached for the charred ledger on the altar. The narrator saw the ledger's spine split. A smudge of ash flaked onto the rock. He had the torn pages in his coat, but the ledger itself seemed to anchor the rite. Then the pivot moved. Acolytes forced the narrator and the scribe apart. The scribe was seized. Hands folded his arms and bound him with thin cords. Take him." The prophet removed dissent. The narrator twisted free and scrambled up the slope. He had to choose: follow to rescue or flee to keep evidence. He chose the ledger. He grabbed the torn fragments and ran down a rock-strewn slope while the amphitheater echoed with the first public release. He heard a single thud and then a stunned silence break like a snapped rope. In the immediate aftermath, villagers screamed and some scrambled toward the cliff. The narrator slid behind a boulder and counted breaths. His hands smelled of salt and ink. He opened the largest fragment and copied a line into his notes: a ritual mechanism, steps to fix a name. He tore another strip for safekeeping and wrapped it in oilcloth. The scribe had been dragged away. The narrator had a small bundle and a raw, angry certainty. Night came down while the narrator moved inland. He found a ruined fisherman's hut and crept inside, rasping his boots on straw as he shut the door. The scribe sat glowing with the first of his bindings, and the hut smelled of old fish and tar. The narrator set the torn ledger on the table and pushed the codex toward the scribe. "Tell me exactly how you copied the names." The narrator. They needed to trace the source and to find a way to break the mechanism. The scribe rubbed his wrists where the cords had bitten him. "I copied what I was shown," he said. "I thought I recorded history. I wrote the dates. I drew the sigils. I made the list legible." He pressed his thumb to an ink smear on his palm. "I did not know they would use it this way." The narrator listened and then asked a precise question. "Who taught you the notation?" The scribe named a faint hand, a scribe in the inner sanctum who had transcribed older rites. The narrator noted the chain: prophet to inner scribe to scribe's copies. They argued in low, urgent sentences about options: expose the ledger publicly, attempt to reclaim the pendant, or use the ledger to warn those marked. The scribe wanted to destroy the pendant. The narrator feared they would all die if they tried. The scribe's hands trembled while he spoke. The narrator felt an emotion shift again. From fear to a dry clarity that shaped a plan: we steal the pendant. The narrator: we do not kill. We disrupt the ritually sanctioned chain. The scribe nodded once hard. They left at night to trace the inner sanctum route. The narrator moved like an archivist on a mission: record, avoid, take sample. They skirted the sanctum walls, found a service gate and slipped inside when the guards rotated. The narrator kept his breath even. He held the torn ledger against his chest. He had rehearsed the steps in his head: in locate pendant, remove pendant, leave. The scribe's mouth set in a thin line behind him. Inside, the inner sanctum smelled of smoke and drying blood. The prophet's pendant hung on a simple peg above a small altar. The narrator reached out while the scribe kept watch at the doorway. Then a noise, a scraping from the corridor. Someone approached. The narrator froze for a beat and then moved. He tugged at the pendant. It resisted. The pendant's cord snagged on a nail. He wrenched. A small shard of obsidian broke free from the bead and cut his knuckle. He hissed, tasting iron on his tongue. Footsteps thundered. Acolytes ran in with torches. The scribe shouted and rushed into the room. "Run!" The narrator. He clutched the pendant and pushed past them. Acolytes grabbed at his coat. The narrator shoved an acolyte aside and spilled into the night. They ran through alleys where laundry snapped on lines. The narrator's sleeve dragged over a puddle and left salt streaks on his coat. They did not get far. In the scramble, the scribe was seized again, this time by the prophet's inner circle. Hands closed over the scribe's face and dragged him back toward the amphitheater. The narrator had the pendant in his palm and a handful of torn ledger leaves. He could hear the scribe's brief, helpless shout. He turned once and saw the prophet step into the lantern light, robe heavy, ceremonial scarification visible on his temple. The narrator ducked into a narrow lane and hid in a doorway while the prophet's voice echoed down the street. The prophet's words were soft but carried. "Bind him. Find the fragments. No mercy for thieves of the right." The narrator pressed the pendant into his satchel and counted his breaths. He had the object that made names fix. He had torn fragments that proved the method. But he also had the knowledge that the prophet had increased the timetable, and that lists now defined households for release. They moved again under moonlight toward a path beneath the cliff. There the narrator stopped to bind a small cut on his hand. He opened one torn leaf to cross-check a marginal note and froze. Someone had smeared an inked name across the margin with a thumb. The smear had run into a dark blot that made the letters smear into one another. He cleaned the smear with his sleeve and read through the salt and oil until the letters resolved. The name there was his. He looked up. The scribe had a hard look and said, "Mine too." The narrator folded the leaf into his palm. The ledger did not lie. The name sat in the obsidian list, set for future winning. The narrator could feel how the plan had changed from proof to survival. He folded the ragged page into his coat and set his jaw. The path ahead required two things: evidence preserved and a way to break the mechanism that sanctified the names. He rose and moved into the dark. Outside the ruined fisherman's hut a gull cried, and waves hit the rocks with the same indifferent force they had that morning. The narrator slowed his breathing and checked the notes again. He thought of the moonlit cradle and the wax-sealed charter of quietus. Those earlier scenes had shown ritual and symbolic marking. Now the obsidian list had converted symbolism into procedure. He could not grant the scribe's wish to keep only memory. He had to act on the ledger's specifics. They drew a plan by lantern light and by pinprick diagrams on a scrap, expose the inner scribe's involvement, present the ledger publicly at a neutral place, and remove the pendant from the prophet's possession so the ritual had no anchor. The scribe argued for destroying the pendant in front of witnesses. The narrator argued for secrecy first, preserve proof, then force a judicial or communal confrontation. They debated in 3 quick rounds of low-voiced sentences. Each round ended with one external event: a knock on the hut's door, a shadow crossing the window, distant drums from the amphitheater signaling a second ceremony. The narrator took the torn ledger and smoothed it on the table. He copied the marginal notes into a new codex and wrapped both bundles in oiled cloth. He then fed one scrap into the flame to prove he could destroy artifacts if needed. The scrap curled and went black. The scribe watched the burn and then looked away as if ashamed. They had a short, urgent argument about whether they should risk the crowd or instead reach out to sympathetic villagers to protect marked households. They agreed to try both, steal proof to interrupt the ritual and send copies to town leaders. As they made final preparations, the narrator felt a new, colder certainty. The ledger had mutated the cult's doctrine into a bureaucratic instrument. The obsidian list made sanctified killing feel like clerical necessity. The narrator folded his notes, took the pendant from his satchel, and looked at the black stone. He felt the weight of a ritual object and the chew of urgency behind his teeth. The scribe touched the pendant briefly and drew his hand back as if burned. They stepped into the night toward another confrontation and toward a plan that balanced exposure with caution. The narrator's last act before they left the hut was to write one line in a small, hidden place in his copy of the ledger. Check the inner scribe's hand in the margin dated to the charter. He tucked the note into his coat and closed the door behind him. On the moonlit path the narrator found a smudged marginal note that named them both. He folded the ragged page into his coat and moved toward the dark. A hooded acolyte shoved the sealed cradle toward the altar, and the narrator lunged to stop it, suspicion tightening his jaw as the prophet raised a hand. The sound of wood on stone cut the pre-dawn wind. The cradle scraped twice across the altar and stopped. The cliff smelled of salt, cold smoke, and beeswax. The narrator's fingers found the leather strap of his satchel and held on. He felt suspicion first and then the motion it forced. He stepped forward to see what the prophet planned, because he had come to prevent a ceremony, not to witness one. The narrator was 45, lean, and carried the posture of someone who catalogued danger the way others carried notebooks. He wore a dark coat with a scarf tucked beneath the collar and thin spectacles that caught the last stars. He had followed the cult's traces from a ruined manuscript to the hermitage. He had read the Charter of Quietus and touched the obsidian list. Each record had set the problem plainly. The group intended a final rite that framed annihilation as salvation. That was the concrete stake, stop a rite that could claim lives and demonstrate a power the narrator could not let spread. Hooded acolytes moved like a machine around the altar. The scribe stood a pace behind the narrator, breath visible, manuscript leaves clutched with salt water drying on his boots. The narrator, "Stop this here," he the words without theatrics. He said them so the prophet could not pretend ignorance. A short, blunt exchange began before the crowd could settle. "You cannot," the narrator started, "you cannot stop what is necessary," the prophet answered, voice low and steady. The narrator reached for the obsidian tablet that lay against the cradle. An acolyte interposed, hand on his forearm. The narrator felt the pressure and pulled back. That single restraint changed the calculus. The rite would happen if he did not force a crisis. Suspicion had been the narrator's first impulse. Doubt followed quickly when he noticed the wet line on the obsidian list that the scribe had showed him earlier that night. The scribe had altered a name. The substitution was still glossy with ink. The narrator's suspicion shifted to a cold focus. Someone within the circle had tampered with the list, and the prophet had not noticed. That suggested division. The narrator stepped closer to the scribe to read the letters, to make the substitution visible to others. "Read it again," the narrator. The scribe pushed the torn page toward the light, voice raw. They removed Lena's name and added the birth in its place. He tapped the replacement with an ink. Stained finger, they swapped a woman for the cradle. The scribe's mouth trembled when he said cradle. His fingers left salt rings on the parchment. Two acolyte lieutenants moved between the scribe and the altar. "One, you lie, Haran. You would betray us." The narrator heard the name and catalogued alliances. Haran, the scribe, had been careful, but someone with authority in the circle, had the power to alter lists in ink and in ritual law. Words began to harden into action. The prophet smiled in that soft, deliberate way that quieted the crowd earlier, and that smile worked now. He lifted his hands and intoned a short syllable that the narrator could not place. An effigy on the altar trembled. A gull on the rocks below flapped once and then slumped, feathers dusted with pale ash. The prophet's gestures were specific and practiced. The narrator saw the gull fall and understood the immediate danger. The rites did more than promise annihilation as an idea. They produced a real effect. Fear pushed into the narrator then. He felt it as a tightening in his jaw and a hitch in his breathing. That fear moved him to act rather than to paralyze him. He stepped into the inner circle, forcing the acolytes to form hands against him. The scribe used the moment to slide a folded leaf of his cloth, wrapped codex toward the narrator beneath the grip of an arm. The narrator did not look up. His right hand closed over the leaf. The leaf contained a notation the narrator had not expected. A counter, ritual formula written in a shorthand that matched a line he had seen in a marginal gloss of a charter the narrator had copied months earlier. The leaf's ink smelled of myrrh and bitter iron. The scribe had risked everything to pass it. Haran, the narrator, showing the leaf so that some in the circle could see. "You altered the list. Why was Lena removed?" The prophet answered instead of Haran. Lena chose otherwise. She understood the release. She to be spared the burden of living and left before the dawn. The prophet's voice did not shake. It carried a steady conviction that would have persuaded men who did not know better. Lena left because of fear, the scribe in a near whisper. She could not watch the cradle. She could not watch the unmaking. His fingers tapped the codex, while the narrator watched for any flicker of duplicity. Acolytes argued in sharp bursts. She fled. One said, "She betrayed us. She was unfit." Another shot back. The circle split into rapid exchanges that bared alliances. The narrator kept his hands visible and kept the folded leaf between thumb and forefinger. Then the prophet moved to demonstrate. He struck the carved sigil on the altar with the bone-wrapped staff. The air contracted around the point of contact. Light seemed to dim in a ring, and a low metallic sound rang from the stone. An effigy at the altar withered, its linen skin blackening into a brittle shell, and a small patch of coastal grass at the cliff's edge browned to ash in a straight line. The unmaking was not idle threat. It had a visible cause and effect the narrator could not ignore. Panic rose among some of the acolytes. The narrator's suspicion shifted again, this time toward urgency. He had moved from suspicion to doubt. Now urgency pushed him to risk physical confrontation. You used the staff on the altar. That proves your right works. He kept his voice level because a sudden shout would break the fragile control the dissenters held. Harren made a decision that cut through the argument. He stepped between the narrator and the prophet, hands open. Stop, Harren, we cannot choose under force. His tone was different than before, edged with a new resolve. The narrator registered Harren's movement as a betrayal of the prophet and a critical emotional shift. The scribe's earlier act had become contagious. The prophet answered with a soft smile. We choose the unmaking because it unbinds the spirit, he said. We do not coerce. We reveal. He pressed his palm to the obsidian pendant at his chest, and the pendant hummed. The pendant's hum swallowed a measure of the gull's final cry and sent a vibration through the stone floor. There was no time for prolonged argument. The scribe pushed the manuscript leaf further into the narrator's hand, and the narrator unfolded it fast enough to read the counter notation. The first line instructed a nulling of intent by invoking an object of attachment, a child's toy or a token carried by the intended subject. The leaf named a simple act to reverse the unmaking in miniature, an exchange of presence and recognition. If we reverse intent around the cradle, we might limit the effect. The narrator. He spoke with a clarity born of calculation. If we bind the ritual's focus to something other than the birth, the rite will not spread beyond the altar. He had not the authority to command, but he could offer a plan that would force the prophet to reveal his hand. Acolytes moved again, some to bind the narrator, others toward the prophet. The scribe slid forward, not to the altar, but to the pile of personal items beside the cradle. The prophet's bone-wrapped staff lay there, along with a charred toy half buried in ash. The scribe's hand hovered over the toy, trembled, and then took it up. He did what he had not done in the hermitage. He named an object of attachment aloud. This toy belonged to a child taken from the village. The scribe, they offered it to the prophet as a sign. If you will the cradle to be the focus, then let this be the tether. His breath was visible. His voice cracked. He had shifted from devotion to decisive action. Argument became a scramble. The narrator shouted, "Bind the toy to the cradle, not the child!" He pushed between two acolytes and reached the altar. An acolyte tried to seize him, and the narrator shoved the hand away, his spectacles sliding down his nose. Acolyte struck. Boots scuffed the stone. The scribe called a name, Harren. And Harren answered with a sharp shove that sent one lieutenant back. 3 rapid lines of exchange occurred in the clash. What are you doing? One acolyte barked, "We must finish." Another said, "Stop him," the prophet ordered. The narrator answered with soft, precise words, "Bind the toy and recite the nulling line now." The scribe began the phrase with a voice that quivered, and then steadied. The prophet moved to intercept. He lunged, ceremonial hood falling back to reveal a slit of ritual scarification along his temple. The narrator felt the burn of the prophet's presence, confident, morally unyielding. They collided, stone rang under the force of hands on bone, and the obsidian pendant struck the cradle's rim with a metallic tap that echoed like a bell. When the prophet's pendant touched the cradle, a pressure dropped the world into a tinny hush. Wind pulled away from the cliff face and a visible vacuum formed around the altar. The cradle began to pale at its edges. A sound like a distant door grinding closed reverberated. The narrator saw acolytes vanish between breaths, their robes blurring and thinning into nothing, leaving only a smear of ash where flesh had been. The prophet drove the pendant down with a shout, and the unmaking spread in an immediate, violent bloom. The cliff erupted into motion. The narrator pushed forward and felt fingers brush his coat as a hand dissolved beside him. He heard the scribe's voice, sharp with a single, human syllable that became a jagged note in the vacuous ring. The scribe dropped the toy. It slid toward the altar and fell into the cradle. The narrator tried to snatch it, and his fingers closed on empty cloth. For a precise, sickening second, the narrator understood a new truth. The rite did not simply remove bodies. It erased presence tied to the ritual's focus. When the toy crossed the threshold of the cradle, a figure at the edge of the circle flared and then was gone, leaving only a damp print on the stone where knees had been. The prophetess face was a mask of triumph as the vacuum swallowed sound and light. The narrator's fear reversed into a cold clarity. He moved as if he had mapped the ritual's mechanism. He rose onto the altar edge and shoved his palm against the carved sigil, reciting the counter notation he had held. The stone was hot beneath his hand, and the pendant's hum bit at his teeth. He repeated the nulling phrase and felt the incision of intent relax in the air. The prophet snarled and grabbed at the narrator's wrist. "You will not unweave what I have bound." The prophet spat. "You cannot claim the unmaking. Haran," the narrator shouted. Forcing Haran's name toward the men who were still whole, Haran, speak the clause of restraint. He forced the scribe's notation into the open and held it like evidence. Haran answered with 3 short lines in a row. "We cannot let this be. We will not be instruments. Who gave you the right? Who named the birth?" Haran's words landed like blows. The acolytes who doubted moved close to Haran and away from the prophet. The circle's unity cracked and the prophet's control thinned. Then the climax hit. The prophet, furious, drove the obsidian pendant into the cradle with both hands and shouted the final syllable. Light collapsed. A roar tore out of the cliff and then fell into a silence like a closed throat. Several acolytes and 2 who had opposed him vanished in an instant. Those left reeled, some dropping to knees, others vomiting as if sick. The narrator felt his ears ring and his lungs heave with the force of the event. When the light returned, only the prophet, the narrator, the scribe, and 4 survivors remained within the ring. The cradle lay charred and cracked. Its interior was empty of anything human. Ash dusted the faces of the living. The scribe fell to his knees and scraped at the stone where the vanished had stood, fingers coming away with blackened residue. Silence arrived like snowfall, no music, no birds, only the distant ocean. The narrator bent, hands on his knees, and he looked directly at the prophet, who named the birth. He asked. The prophet's eyes were hooded and dark. He did not flinch. "We named it collectively. The prophet we offered." It was consent. His tone did not shift into guilt. He sounded certain. The narrator's suspicion shifted into grief, then anger. He felt the tightening in his throat and the way his hands curled into fists. "Consent given under ritual pressure is not consent," he said. He pulled his spectacles off and wiped them on his scarf, methodical gestures to steady his voice. The scribe, Haran, and 2 acolytes who had favored restraint began to gather relics and papers, moving with a new urgency that was not purely ritual. They searched for documents, charters, the obsidian list, and the crumpled leaves the scribe had carried. The narrator photographed the ruined sigil with his small camera, pressing a hand over the viewfinder when the light stung his eyes. A survivor whispered the name of one who had vanished. The narrator repeated it, and the sound of it in his mouth made his jaw clench. The scribe copied the last lines of the codex with a trembling hand, teeth set against the strain. He read aloud to anchor their work, dates, names, and the notation of substitution. The narrator watched the scribe's fingers move and understood that these marks would be the only proof left of what had occurred. An external event broke the small circle. A shout from the ridge where a hooded form had waited. The unknown watcher, the figure who had been visible on the high path, stood in profile against the dawn, watching. The narrator felt his neck prick with a practical dread. He had to act. There might be other circles, other altars. Who watches? The narrator called. The watcher did not answer, but raised a hand in a loose salute and stepped back into a fold of rock. The narrator felt a pulse of annoyance at the lack of an immediate explanation, and then the weight of responsibility. He had to gather evidence and choose how to reveal this doctrine that had led to immediate death. The scribe spoke with new resolve. "We publish the codex," he said. "We tell the churches and the magistrates. We put this to the light." His voice had the tremor of exhaustion, but the direction of a person who had decided a course. "If you publish, the prophet's followers will scatter, but some will hide the method. The narrator, we must be precise. Names, dates, writes the toy, the staff, the pendant, photographs, copies, witnesses. He listed items in a dry, practical cadence. The scribe nodded. Harren objected quietly. If we go to the magistrates, they will call us heretics and burn the codex. The people will deny what they do not want to see. We risk silence and blood. His hesitation was a measured calculation. The narrator considered the options and then set a decision in motion. They agreed to do both. Distribute copies through secure hands and place a sealed packet with a sympathetic scholar in the city who would make the documents public only if the cult attempted another rite. The narrator negotiated the terms aloud and wrote names on a scrap the scribe handed him. They worked until the sun had cleared the ridge and the cliff smelled of burned herbs. The surviving acolytes wrapped relics in cloth, and the narrator photographed the charred toy the scribe had retrieved from beneath the altar. The narrator pocketed a sliver of the toy's wood, a piece small enough to hide but concrete enough to prove touch. In the hours that followed, the scribe and Harren argued about whether to bring their testimony to church elders. Their debate was heated and short. We will do both. Harren, we will take the codex to the city and to the magistrate, and we will leave copies where the prophet cannot trace them. The scribe agreed after 3 lines of back and forth. The narrator kept watch as they packed. He photographed the ruined sigil once more, then the cradle, then the spot where the gull had fallen. He documented the exact placement of each charred item, so the record would show cause and effect rather than rumor. He felt a steadying duty, to make sure the evidence could not be dismissed as superstition. An unexpected twist changed how the narrator understood earlier events. While packing, the scribe found an erased line in the Charter of Quietus, an instruction that named an apprentice who had been given authority to substitute names in the obsidian list if a blood relative left. That clause meant the substitution of Linus' name might have followed procedural precedent rather than being a simple act of malice. The scribe read the clause aloud and the narrator heard a different meaning fall into place. Maybe Lena had been removed under a covenant the prophet had relied on, and the prophet had bent that covenant toward annihilation. The twist shifted culpability in a narrow, dangerous way. Harren slammed his palm on the pack and said, "That is manipulation." The covenant was never meant to claim lives. His voice cut through the small group. The narrator reminded himself to keep facts clear, evidence, not moralizing, and to collect the clause as proof of how the prophet had routed law into violence. At midday they descended the cliff path with what remained of the circle. The unknown watcher was gone. The scribe carried the cloth, wrapped codex. Harren walked with the narrator. Survivors trailed behind. They were quiet, but their silence was not peaceful. Their faces registered shock, guilt, and the hard work of deciding what to do next. They stopped once on the slope when the scribe could not keep his hands from shaking. He opened the codex to copy a final line. The ritual says wording for the Great Release and the list of names associated with the last rites. He copied slowly, and the narrator watched the rhythm of his hands to gauge the scribe's composure. The scribe murmured a single name, Lena, then closed the codex and swallowed. "We owe her that record." The narrator. He knew the line might be the only way to give Lena a place in the chain of evidence, and to show that she had been removed not by whim but by a series of legalistic contortions that made murder seem lawful. They reached the hermitage by afternoon. The narrator placed the charred toy in a small envelope and sealed it in his satchel. He placed the photographs and the copied clause beside it. The scribe held the codex to his chest and tasted salt on his lips. Harren inspected the horizon as if waiting for the prophet to return with more followers. That evening, an unplanned event occurred. A courier from the city arrived with a letter addressed to the narrator from a scholar he had once trusted. The scholar requested proof of the cult's rites and warned that the city's magistrate had been hearing rumors about a dangerous spiritual movement in the coastal villages. The letter changed their timetable. It offered them a path to public exposure sooner than they had planned. They decided to go to the city in 2 days and to distribute copies through the scholar that night. The scribe would travel with a sealed packet. Harren would arrange safe passage for survivors. The narrator would remain to prepare detailed photographs and a sworn statement. As the narrator prepared his statement, he reflected on the chain of events he had witnessed. The moonlit cradle from the first testimony, the Charter of Quietus with its wax seal, the obsidian list's substitution, the prophet's demonstration, and finally the great release at dawn. He catalogued each moment into a chain he could present. The evidence was concrete. Names, altered clauses, the charred toy, photographs of the sigil, and witnesses who had seen people vanish. He did not permit himself to abstract the horror. He kept to objects and actions. At dusk they held one last conversation beneath the hermitage eaves. The scribe spoke of remorse in short sentences. I copied what I was told. I thought it was doctrine, not death. You changed the list. Harren simply. You saved a chance. The scribe nodded. The narrator the scribe to read aloud the line he had added to the codex. The scribe did so in 3 measured phrases and then closed his eyes as if to seal it. The narrator recorded every word in his notes. When they left at dawn 2 days later, the narrator carried the sealed envelope with the toy fragment and the photographs. The scribe carried the codex. Harren moved as escort. They descended the cliff path into a world that still smelled of the sea and of burned herbs. On the ridge, a silhouette stepped from behind a rock and watched them as they passed. The silhouette did not call. It did not approach. It only looked and then moved away along the high path. The narrator looked up once and then kept walking. He had what he needed: objects, names, and witnesses. He had also what he had not asked for, a stark lesson about how law, ritual, and persuasion could be braided into violence. That understanding would guide how he presented the evidence. He would not speak in grand moral terms. He would show magistrates charred wood, inked substitutions, a charred cradle, and the names of those who vanished. The scribe had one final act before they reached the city gate. He spoke without looking at the narrator. Keep the toy safe, he said, and if they try to call us liars, tell them Linus' name. The narrator slipped the envelope deeper into his satchel and felt the roughness of the wood against his palm. They passed the gate into the city with the burden of what had occurred pressing in practical ways. Testimony to be given, copies to be entrusted, and a scholar's word to be secured. The narrator's suspicion had propelled him to the cliff. His doubt had forced a challenge in the circle. His urgency had produced the scramble that fractured the right. Grief and resolution guided the decisions that followed. The chapter closed with them in motion, descending the path, carrying proof, and moving toward institutions that might respond. On the road out of the city, a sealed packet was offered to the scholar at dawn. The scholar received the papers and photographs, weighed them, and promised to hold some for public release should another altar appear. The narrator watched the scholar's hands as he counted the pages and nodded. The physical act of handing over the evidence felt decisive. It was not an end to belief, but it was a concrete step to prevent repetition. Back at the harbor, the narrator photographed the water, where the gull had fallen. He placed the charred sliver of toy into a box of evidence. The scribe and Harren boarded separate carriages for safety. The narrator stayed to prepare his sworn statement in the scholar's study and to digitize the photographs for secure distribution. Late that night, the narrator sat with the codex open before him, copying the final lines into a ledger he would carry to the magistrates. The scribe's ink-stained fingers paused when the narrator mentioned Linus' name. He nodded and added a marginal note on lineage and circumstances. The narrator felt the weight of names on the page and the concrete responsibility to ensure each one mattered. They had changed the immediate outcome. The ritual had been recorded, the codex copied, witnesses prepared, and a packet secured with a scholar. The prophet's immediate plan had succeeded in producing an unmaking, and there was no undoing that violence, but the group's social power had fractured. The narrator understood that stopping an ideology required more than a single exposure. It demanded legal, social, and textual pressure to unweave what the prophet had stitched. In the last hour before he rested, the narrator placed the charred toy into a small cloth bag, tucked it into his leather satchel. and sealed the satchel with a strip of wax. He set his pocket watch on the table and wound it once, a small, ordered motion after a day of collapse. He had seen ritual kill presence. He would use plain records and civic process to fight the idea that annihilation could be sacred. Outside the scholar's window, the high ridge showed a thin shape moving away in the moonlight. The narrator stood, walked to the glass, and watched the figure leave the cliff path. He felt unease, but also the clarity of a task. He had evidence to deliver, papers to place in safe hands, and a testimony to give on behalf of those who had vanished. He turned back to his ledger, to the list of names, and to the charred sliver of wood in his satchel. He wrote Lena's name once more and folded the page into the packet headed to the magistrate. Then he closed the packet, sealed it, and laid it beside the photographs, ready to be carried. The act was concrete and deliberate. It ended the chapter with movement, a sealed packet, a decision to present the evidence, and a step toward holding a deadly belief accountable. They left the city the next morning under a flat light. The scribe and Haran set off for secure houses. The narrator prepared to meet magistrates and scholars. Behind them, beyond the ridge, the cliff waited, stone and salt and a cradle scorched into memory. The narrator had the toy in his satchel and the photographs in his camera. He had no illusions about how long an idea survives. He did, however, possess the materials to challenge it in court, in libraries, and in public record. With that concrete plan, he closed the ledger and stepped out into the noon, the charred evidence heavy, but contained in the leather bag at his side.